At 8:45 in the morning on October 11th, 1943, Colonel Neel Kearby climbed into the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt at a muddy airstrip near Port Moresby, New Guinea. The aircraft was named Fiery Ginger, after his wife Virginia back home in Texas. Kearby was 32 years old, which made him practically ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of the young men in his command were barely out of their teens. But Kearby was not like most pilots. He was the commanding officer of the 348th Fighter Group, and he had spent the previous year developing tactics that would turn the massive, supposedly clumsy Thunderbolt into one of the deadliest weapons in the Pacific theater. The mission that morning was reconnaissance. Kearby would lead a flight of 4 fighters over the Japanese stronghold at Wewak, approximately 450 miles northwest of Port Moresby. Their job was to observe enemy airfields, count aircraft, note defensive positions, and return with intelligence that would shape future bombing raids. It was supposed to be a simple observation flight. No one expected what would happen next. Kearby's wingman that day was Captain Bill Dunham, a skilled pilot who would eventually score 16 victories of his own. The other 2 aircraft were flown by Captain John Moore and Major Raymond Gallagher. 4 Thunderbolts, 4 pilots, against whatever the Japanese 4th Air Army had waiting for them over Wewak. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not supposed to be in the Pacific at all. When the 348th Fighter Group arrived in Australia in June of 1943, the pilots who flew P-38 Lightnings looked at the big, barrel-shaped Thunderbolt and laughed. The P-38 was sleek, twin-engined, with a distinctive twin-boom design that made it look fast even sitting on the ground. The P-47 looked like someone had inflated a fighter aircraft with a bicycle pump. It was huge, over 7 tons fully loaded. The largest single-engine fighter of the entire war. Pilots joked that if you got in trouble flying a Thunderbolt, you could unbuckle your straps and run around inside the fuselage to dodge enemy bullets. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. General George Kenney, the commander of 5th Air Force, was skeptical when the Thunderbolts arrived. The Pacific theater was different from Europe, vast distances over water, jungle airstrips carved out of unforgiving terrain, Japanese fighters that could turn inside anything the Americans flew. The P-38 had proven itself in these conditions. The P-47 was an unknown quantity, and its reputation from the European theatre was mixed at best. Some pilots loved it, others considered it a death trap in a dogfight. Kearby believed differently. He had studied the Thunderbolt's characteristics obsessively during training back in the United States, and he had identified something that most pilots missed. The P-47 was not designed to dogfight. It was designed to dominate from above. The aircraft had a turbo, supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. At high altitude, where the supercharger could compress the thin air and feed it to the engine, the Thunderbolt was one of the fastest aircraft in the world. And in a dive, nothing could catch it. Nothing could outrun it. The Thunderbolt could reach speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour in a steep dive, and it could pull out of that dive without tearing itself apart. Kearby understood what this meant tactically. If you flew high, dove on your enemy, and then used your speed to zoom back to altitude, you controlled the engagement. You chose when to fight and when to disengage. The lighter, more maneuverable Japanese fighters could turn inside you all day long, but it would not matter if you never let them get close enough to try. There was another advantage that Kearby appreciated more than most. The P-47 carried 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Most fighters of the era carried 4 guns, or 6 at most. The Thunderbolt had 8, and it could carry up to 3,400 rounds of ammunition. When a P-47 pilot pressed the trigger, he unleashed a storm of lead that could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. A 5-second burst from all 8 guns would put approximately 500 rounds into a target area roughly 3 feet by 3 feet at 1,100 feet distance. Japanese aircraft, designed for maneuverability rather than survivability, had minimal armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. They were extraordinarily vulnerable to the Thunderbolt's devastating firepower. Kearby had proven his tactics worked. On September 4, 1943, he scored his first two victories, a Mitsubishi G-4M bomber and its escorting fighter. 10 days later, he outran and destroyed a Mitsubishi Ki-46, a twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft specifically designed for speed. On September 23, he was promoted to full colonel. By the morning of October 11th, Kearby had 4 confirmed kills. He was 1 victory away from becoming an ace. The 4 Thunderbolts took off from their forward airstrip and climbed into the morning sky. Kearby led them in a wide spiral, gaining altitude with every circuit. By the time they leveled off and headed northwest toward Wewak, they were cruising at 26,000 feet. The air at that altitude was thin and cold. The pilots breathed through oxygen masks and wore heated flight suits to ward off temperatures that dropped well below freezing. But up there, above the clouds, above the range of most Japanese fighters, they were in their element. They were where the Thunderbolt was meant to be. The flight to Wewak took approximately 90 minutes. As they approached the Japanese base complex, Kearby dropped to 20,000 feet and began the reconnaissance portion of the mission. Below them, spread across several airfields, was the heart of Japanese air power in New Guinea. The 4th Air Army had established Wewak as its primary operating base in the region. Multiple runways, hundreds of aircraft, fuel dumps, maintenance facilities, and thousands of personnel occupied the area around the town. The Americans had struck Wewak hard in August, destroying approximately 170 aircraft on the ground and in the air over a 5-day bombing campaign. But the Japanese had rebuilt. They always rebuilt. And now, 2 months later, Wewak was active again. Kearby counted aircraft on the dispersal areas. He noted defensive positions. He observed the layout of the airfields. The reconnaissance mission was going exactly as planned. Then Kearby saw something below him that changed everything. A lone Japanese fighter was cruising at approximately 20,000 feet, apparently unaware of the 4 Thunderbolts high above. Kearby identified it as a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to the Allies by the codename Oscar. The Oscar was the workhorse of the Japanese Army Air Force, a lightweight, highly maneuverable fighter that had dominated the skies over Southeast Asia and the Pacific in the early years of the war. It could turn inside almost anything the Allies flew, but it was also lightly armed, with only 2 machine guns, and it had virtually no armor protection for the pilot or the fuel tanks. Kearby made a decision. The reconnaissance mission was essentially complete. They had the intelligence they came for, but there was a Japanese fighter below him, vulnerable, unaware. Kearby signaled his wingmen and rolled his Thunderbolt into a dive. The physics of what happened next were simple but devastating. Kearby started his dive from 26,000 feet with a 6,000-foot altitude advantage. As his P-47 pitched over and accelerated, gravity added its force to the engine's thrust. Within seconds, Kearby was screaming downward at over 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot below had no warning. One moment, he was flying a routine patrol. The next moment, 8 streams of 50 caliber tracers converged on his aircraft from above and behind. Kearby opened fire at approximately 1,500 feet distance. At the combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, he had perhaps 2 seconds of firing time. It was enough. The Japanese fighter erupted in flames and began spiraling toward the jungle below. Kearby pulled hard on the stick, using his tremendous speed to zoom back toward altitude. His 5th kill. He was now an ace. But as Kearby climbed, he saw something that should have ended the mission immediately. Below and to the east, a massive formation of Japanese aircraft was approaching Wewak. Approximately 12 twin-engine bombers, probably Mitsubishi Ki-21 escorted by 36 fighters. Some were Oscars. Others were Kawasaki Ki-61 Heians, which the Allies called Tonys. The Tony was a relatively new aircraft for the Japanese, featuring an inline liquid-cooled engine that gave it a profile similar to European fighters. It was faster and more heavily armed than the Oscar, and it could dive with Allied aircraft in ways that the Oscar could not. The numerical odds were now 12-1 against the Americans. Kearby had 4 aircraft. The Japanese had 48. The reconnaissance mission was complete. Fuel was becoming a concern. The sensible thing to do was to call his flight together and head for home. Kearby did not do the sensible thing. He looked at the Japanese formation below him. He looked at his fuel gauge. He looked at the 3 other Thunderbolts forming up on his wing. And then Colonel Neel Kearby gave the signal to attack. What followed would become one of the most celebrated air battles of the Pacific War. 4 American P-47 Thunderbolts diving into a formation of 48 Japanese aircraft. The odds were absurd. The decision was arguably reckless, and what Kearby did in the next 15 minutes would earn him the Medal of Honor. The Americans dove out of the sun, building speed as they plunged toward the Japanese formation. Kearby led the attack, picking his first target from among the escorting fighters. The Japanese were focused on their bombers, their formation discipline, their approach to Wewak. They did not see the 4 Thunderbolts until it was far too late. Kearby's first target in the main engagement was an Oscar flying on the edge of the fighter escort. He came in from 7 o'clock, above and behind the Japanese formation, and opened fire at long range. The Oscar tried to break left, but the P-47's rate of closure was too great. Kearby's burst caught the Japanese fighter at the wing root. The aircraft came apart in the air. Before the debris had finished falling, Kearby was already lining up his next target. The battle devolved into chaos almost immediately. The organized Japanese formation scattered as pilots realized they were under attack from above. Some dove for the deck, others tried to climb and engage. The bombers pressed on toward Wewak, abandoning their escorts to deal with the American intruders. In the swirling confusion, Kearby found himself alone with targets everywhere he looked. He shot down a second Oscar with a deflection shot as the Japanese pilot tried to turn into his attack. The Oscar's engine exploded and the aircraft fell away burning. Kearby pulled up, rolled, and dove again. A Tony was climbing toward him from below, its pilot apparently trying to get above the American for an advantageous attack angle. Kearby pushed his nose down and met the Tony head-on. Both aircraft opened fire simultaneously, but the P-47's 8 machine guns vastly outclassed the Tony's 2 nose-mounted guns. The Japanese fighter took hits across its entire length and fell away trailing smoke. 3 kills in the main engagement. Combined with the lone Oscar he had destroyed before the battle started, Kearby now had 8 total victories, 4 in this single mission. He had already exceeded the previous American record for kills in a single engagement. But Kearby was not finished. As he pulled up from his 3rd kill, he spotted Captain John Moore in trouble. Moore's Thunderbolt was being pursued by 2 Japanese fighters, both Tonys, closing from behind. Moore was diving, trying to use the P-47's superior dive speed to escape, but the Tonys were staying with him. In another few seconds, they would be in firing range. Kearby did not hesitate. He rolled his Thunderbolt onto its back and dove after the pursuing Tonys. He was now committing to a fight at low altitude with depleted ammunition, low fuel, and 2 enemy fighters between him and his wingman. It was exactly the kind of situation his own tactics warned against. But Moore was his pilot, his responsibility, and Kearby was not going to let him die. The first Tony never saw Kearby coming. The Japanese pilot was focused entirely on Moore's aircraft, lining up for a killing shot. Kearby came in from above and behind at a steep angle, firing as he dove. The burst caught the Tony in the fuselage and cockpit. The aircraft rolled inverted and dove straight into the jungle. The second Tony broke hard right as his wingman exploded. It was a good maneuver, a textbook response to being bounced from above, but the P-47's roll rate, surprisingly good for such a large aircraft, allowed Kearby to follow. He came around in a tight turn, used his remaining speed to close the distance, and fired a long burst that walked across the Tony's wing and engine. The Japanese fighter began smoking immediately. It dove toward the jungle and disappeared into the trees. 6 kills. 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed in approximately 15 minutes of combat. Colonel Neel Kearby had just set a new American record for the most enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. But the battle was not over. As Kearby climbed back toward altitude, he saw more Japanese fighters converging on his position. The initial surprise was gone. The Japanese pilots knew they were under attack. and they were organizing a response. Multiple aircraft were climbing toward the lone Thunderbolt, cutting off his escape route. Kearby's fuel warning light came on. He had perhaps enough fuel to get home, but only if he left immediately. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. The smart move was to run. Kearby made one more pass. He spotted a Tony that was positioning for an attack on another Thunderbolt. Diving through a swarm of Japanese fighters, Kearby opened fire with his remaining ammunition. The Tony took hits, but did not go down immediately. Kearby's gun camera, which recorded his firing runs, ran out of film during this attack. Without film evidence, he could only claim a probable on this 7th aircraft, rather than a confirmed kill. With his ammunition expended, Kearby finally turned for home. He called his flight together on the radio, counting heads. All 4 Thunderbolts were still flying. All 4 pilots were alive. They had engaged a formation of 48 enemy aircraft, destroyed at least 9 of them, and escaped without a scratch. Captain Bill Dunham and Captain John Moore had each scored kills during the engagement, with Moore downing 2 Tonys and Dunham accounting for 1. Combined with Kearby's 6 confirmed victories and 1 probable, the 4-aircraft flight had destroyed a significant portion of the Japanese escort force in a matter of minutes. The flight back to Port Moresby was long and tense. Fuel gauges sat near empty. The Thunderbolt's big engines consumed gasoline at a prodigious rate, especially when flown at combat power. Kearby led his flight toward an emergency airfield at Leh, which was closer than their home base. They landed with less than 75 gallons remaining in their tanks, much longer in the air, and they would have been swimming home. When Kearby climbed out of his cockpit, the ground crews were already waiting. Word of the battle had preceded him. The other pilots in the flight had been calling out kills on the radio throughout the engagement, and everyone at the airfield knew that something extraordinary had happened over Wewak. General George Kenney, the 5th Air Force commander, was meeting with General Douglas MacArthur when Kearby reported to headquarters. After hearing the details of the mission and reviewing the gun camera footage, Kenney turned to MacArthur. "The record number of official victories in a single fight so far is 5, Kenney explained. "That was credited to a Navy pilot who received the Medal of Honor for the action," Kenney continued. "As soon as I can get witness statements from the other 3 pilots and verify at least 5 kills, I want to recommend Kearby for the same decoration." MacArthur agreed immediately. If the kills could be verified, he would approve the recommendation and forward it to Washington. The verification process took several weeks. Intelligence officers interviewed Dunham, Moore, and Gallagher about what they had witnessed. They reviewed gun camera footage, frame by frame. They cross-referenced the engagement with Japanese radio traffic and subsequent reconnaissance of the Wewak area. The Japanese 4th Air Army's records would later show that they lost multiple aircraft and pilots on October 11, 1943, including at least 1 squadron commander and 1 wing commander among the dead. 6 confirmed kills, 1 probable, the largest single mission score by any American fighter pilot in the war to that point, and the remarkable fact that all 4 Thunderbolts returned safely, despite odds of 12 to 1. On January 23, 1944, Colonel Neel Kearby stood at attention in General Douglas MacArthur's office in Brisbane, Australia. MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on Kearby's chest, making him the first United States Army Air Forces fighter pilot to receive the nation's highest military decoration in World War II. The official citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy." Colonel Kearby volunteered to lead a flight of 4 fighters to reconnoitre the strongly defended enemy base at Wewak. Having observed enemy installations and reinforcements at 4 airfields and secured important tactical information, he saw an enemy fighter below, made a diving attack and shot it down in flames. The small formation then sighted approximately 12 enemy bombers, accompanied by 36 fighters. Although his mission had been completed, his fuel was running low, and the numerical odds were 12 to 1. He gave the signal to attack. The citation continued. Diving into the midst of the enemy airplanes, he shot down 3 in quick succession. Observing one of his comrades with 2 enemy fighters in pursuit, he destroyed both enemy aircraft. The enemy broke off in large numbers to make a multiple attack on his airplane, but despite his peril, he made one more pass before seeking cloud protection. Coming into the clear, he called his flight together and led them to a friendly base. Colonel Kearby brought down 6 enemy aircraft in this action, undertaken with superb daring after his mission was completed. General Kenny, who witnessed the ceremony, later wrote about Kearby's reaction. "The general did the thing upright," Kenny recalled, and so overwhelmed Neel that he wanted to go right back to New Guinea and knock down some more Japs to prove that he was as good as MacArthur had said he was. That desire to keep proving himself would ultimately be Kearby's undoing. The success of the October 11th mission validated everything Kearby had been teaching his pilots about the P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that P-38 pilots had mocked as too big, too slow, and too clumsy had just proven itself in spectacular fashion. 4 Thunderbolts against 48 Japanese aircraft, 9 kills confirmed, no losses. The critics fell silent. Within months of Kearby's great air battle, the 348th Fighter Group had transformed the perception of the P-47 inches the Pacific Theatre. Between August and December of 1943, the group claimed over 150 aerial victories, while losing only 8 pilots. That kill ratio was extraordinary. It proved that when flown correctly, using the dive and zoom tactics that Kearby had pioneered, the Thunderbolt was as deadly as any fighter in the American arsenal. The key to Kearby's success was understanding what the P-47 could and could not do. The Thunderbolt was not designed to turn. It was designed to kill from altitude and escape using speed. If you let yourself get dragged into a low-level turning fight with an Oscar or a Zero, you were flying against the aircraft's strengths and into its weaknesses. Japanese fighters could turn inside you all day long at low altitude. They would get on your tail, they would shoot you down, and there was nothing you could do about it once you let them close the distance. But if you stayed high, if you dove on your targets and immediately climbed back to altitude, you controlled the engagement. The Japanese could not follow you in a dive. Their lighter aircraft simply could not match the Thunderbolt's terminal velocity, and they could not catch you if you used your dive speed to zoom climb back above them. The P-47's massive engine and turbo supercharger gave it an advantage at altitude that no Japanese fighter could match. The 850 caliber machine guns made these tactics particularly effective against Japanese aircraft. The Ki-43 Oscar and the A6M0 were both built to the same philosophy. Minimize weight to maximize maneuverability. Sacrifice armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save every possible pound. Against American aircraft of 1941 and early 1942. This philosophy worked brilliantly. The Japanese could outmaneuver anything the Allies flew, and their pilots were superbly trained in aggressive air combat tactics. But against the Thunderbolt's devastating firepower, the lack of protection was fatal. A 5-second burst from 850 caliber machine guns could put 500 rounds into a target. Japanese fighters simply could not absorb that kind of punishment. One good hit on a fuel tank and the aircraft erupted in flames. One burst into the engine and the pilot was dead before he knew he was under attack. The Thunderbolt's firepower transformed brief windows of opportunity into confirmed kills. The 348th Fighter Group produced 20 P-47 aces during the war, more than any other Thunderbolt unit in the Pacific. Among them were pilots like Bill Dunham, who had flown on Kearby's wing during the October 11th mission and went on to score 16 victories. Bob Rowland, Lawrence O'Neill, Walt Benz, Sam Blair, and George Davis, a young pilot who scored his first victories flying Thunderbolts with the 348th and would later earn a posthumous Medal of Honor flying F-86 Sabres in Korea. The group ultimately scored 396 aerial victories, more than half of all the kills credited to 5th Air Force P-47 seconds during the entire war. They won 2 distinguished unit citations. They proved that the massive, supposedly clumsy Thunderbolt was one of the deadliest weapons in the Pacific sky. And at the center of all of this was Neel Kearby, his tactical innovations, his personal example, his willingness to lead from the front rather than command from behind a desk. But Kearby's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He was competitive to a fault. He wanted to be the best, and being the best meant having the highest score. By January of 1944, when MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest, Kearby had 21 confirmed victories. He was tied with Richard Bong, a P-38 pilot, who was also flying out of New Guinea, for the lead among American aces in the Pacific. The magic number that both men were chasing was 26. That was the score of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's top ace of World War I. The first pilot to break Rickenbacker's record would secure his place in aviation history forever. General Kenny understood the psychology at play. He had seen it before with other high-scoring aces. The competitive drive that made them successful in combat could become reckless when scores got high enough. Kenny tried to slow Kearby down. He promoted him to a staff position at 5th Fighter Command Headquarters in November of 1943, partly to get him out of the cockpit and behind a desk where he would be safer. Kearby hated desk duty. He lived to fly. He lived to fight. He requested permission to continue flying combat missions even, while assigned to headquarters staff, and Kenny reluctantly agreed. But Kenny imposed restrictions. Kearby could fly no more than 2 combat missions per week, and if he scored a kill on one of those missions, he was to immediately break off and leave the combat area. No pursuing additional targets, no staying to fight when the advantage was lost. Kearby agreed to the restrictions. He did not always follow them. On January 9, 1944, Kearby scored a double victory, bringing his total to 21 and tying him with Bong for the Pacific lead. On February 15th, Bong scored his 22nd victory. Kearby was now behind in the race to break Rickenbacker's record. The pressure to catch up pushed Kearby to take risks that violated his own tactical principles. The very doctrine that had made him successful, the discipline of dive and zoom attacks, followed by immediate disengagement, began to slip. Kearby started staying in fights too long. He started making second passes when he should have been climbing back to altitude. He started doing exactly what he had warned his pilots never to do. On March 5, 1944, Colonel Neel Kearby took off from Sador Airfield on what would be his final mission. He was leading a 3-aircraft patrol with Captain Bill Dunham and Captain Sam Blair, both experienced aces who had flown with him many times before. The target area was, once again, the airfields around Wewak. Flying at approximately 22,000 feet, the 3 Thunderbolts spotted 3 Kawasaki Ki-48 bombers approaching Dagwa Airfield for a landing. The Ki-48, which the Allies called Lily, was a twin-engine light bomber used primarily for tactical support missions. The 3 aircraft were returning from a mission, low on fuel, and apparently unaware of the American fighters high above. The Japanese at Dagwa saw the danger before the bomber crews did. The 77th Sentai, a fighter unit equipped with Ki-43 Oscars, scrambled 5 aircraft to intercept the American intruders. Kearby dove on the bombers, with Dunham and Blair following. Each American pilot claimed 1 bomber in the initial pass, but Kearby was not satisfied with his kill. His burst had hit the Ki-48, but he had not seen it go down. Rather than climb back to altitude as his own doctrine dictated, Kearby circled around to make a second pass. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That second pass was the last mistake Neel Kearby ever made. The 5 Oscars from the 77th Sentai had climbed into the engagement while Kearby made his circle. They caught him at relatively low altitude, with reduced airspeed from his turning maneuver, in exactly the kind of low-level fight that the Thunderbolt was designed to avoid. An Oscar piloted by Warrant Officer Koichi Mitoma closed on Kearby's tail and opened fire. The .50 caliber machine guns that made the P-47 so deadly against lightly armored Japanese aircraft worked both ways. Japanese 7.7mm machine guns were much less powerful, but a concentrated burst into the cockpit of any aircraft was lethal. Kearby's Thunderbolt took hits across the fuselage and cockpit. The aircraft rolled and dove toward the jungle. Bill Dunham saw Kearby's P-47 go down. He dove after the Oscar that had made the killing shot and destroyed it, avenging his commander. But it was too late. Kearby's fiery Ginger 4 was already falling. Witnesses on the ground, local villagers who had watched the air battle from below, reported that Kearby managed to bail out of his stricken aircraft. His parachute opened. He appeared to be alive as he descended toward the jungle. But when he landed, his parachute became tangled in the trees. When rescuers found his body years later, they determined that he had died from bullet wounds sustained during the attack. He may have been dead before his parachute ever opened. Colonel Neel Ernest Kearby was 32 years old. He had 22 confirmed aerial victories. He was the highest-scoring P-47 pilot of the Pacific Theater, a record that would stand for the remainder of the war. He was the first Army Air Force's fighter pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II, and he died because he violated the tactical doctrine that he himself had created. Dunham and Blair searched for Kearby until their fuel ran low, calling on the radio, flying low over the jungle, hoping for any sign that their commander had survived. They found nothing. Kearby was officially listed as missing in action. It would be 3 years before his remains were recovered by a Royal Australian Air Force search team in 1947. It would be another 2 years before those remains were positively identified. On July 23, 1949, Colonel Neel Kearby was buried with full military honours at Hillcrest Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas. He was laid to rest next to his older brother, Major John Gallatin Kearby III, who had also died during the war. He was survived by his wife Virginia, the fiery ginger for whom he had named all of his aircraft, and their 3 young sons. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that Neel Kearby championed, went on to become one of the most successful fighter bombers of World War II. In the European theatre, Thunderbolts flew more sorties than any other American fighter. P-47 pilots destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than half of them in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe. The aircraft proved invaluable in the ground attack role, using its heavy armament and remarkable ability to absorb battle damage to support Allied troops from the Normandy invasion through the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The Thunderbolt's durability became legendary. Stories circulated of P-47 seconds returning to base with entire cylinders shot off their radial engines, of pilots surviving direct hits from 20mm cannon shells that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, of aircraft making wheels-up landings in fields and their pilots walking away without a scratch. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, with its air-cooled radial design, could absorb punishment that would have destroyed the liquid-cooled engines of other fighters. There was no radiator to puncture, no coolant lines to sever. As long as enough cylinders kept firing, the Thunderbolt kept flying. By the end of the war, over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had been produced, making it one of the most numerous American fighters of the conflict. The aircraft served with the air forces of Brazil, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, in addition to the United States. Brazilian pilots flew Thunderbolts in combat over Italy. Free French pilots flew them against German forces in occupied France. Soviet pilots evaluated captured examples and incorporated lessons learned into their own aircraft designs. The 348th Fighter Group, the unit that Neel Kearby had built into the most successful Thunderbolt outfit in the Pacific, continued fighting after his death. They transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in early 1945, following the general trend away from the Thunderbolt in the Pacific theater as the war moved closer to Japan and longer range became increasingly important. But the legacy of Kearby's tactical innovations lived on in every pilot who had served under him and every unit that adopted his dive and zoom doctrine. Among those who carried Kearby's legacy forward was George Davis, the young pilot who scored his first victories flying P-47 seconds with the 348th Fighter Group. Davis survived the war with 7 confirmed kills. He returned to civilian life briefly before rejoining the Air Force when it became an independent service in 1947. During the Korean War, now flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15 seconds, Davis became one of the top American aces of that conflict. On February 10, 1952, Major George Davis was killed in action while attacking a formation of MiG-15 seconds over North Korea. He was awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The connection between Kearby and Davis illustrates something important about how military excellence propagates through generations. Kearby developed tactics and trained pilots who went on to train other pilots who went on to serve in subsequent conflicts. The lessons learned over Wewak in 1943 echoed through Korea and Vietnam and beyond. The principles of energy fighting, of using altitude and speed to control engagements, of understanding your aircraft's strengths and avoiding situations that favored your enemy, remained relevant long after piston engines gave way to jets. The P-47 Thunderbolt that Kearby flew on October 11, 1943, the fiery Ginger, that carried him to glory over Wewak, was destroyed when Kearby was shot down 5 months later. His subsequent aircraft, Fiery Ginger 4, crashed into the New Guinea jungle and was eventually reclaimed by the vegetation. But fragments of Kearby's Thunderbolts have been recovered over the decades. The tail section of one of his aircraft is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, along with his Medal of Honor and other decorations. A full-sized replica of the original Fiery Ginger stands in the museum's collection, painted in the olive-drab camouflage that Kearby's aircraft wore during those deadly months over New Guinea. Visitors can stand next to it and appreciate just how massive the Thunderbolt really was. 7 tons of American engineering, armed with 8 machine guns and powered by an 18-cylinder radial engine that could propel it faster than 400 miles per hour. It was not graceful like the Spitfire or sleek like the Mustang. It was a brute, a brawler, a machine designed to absorb punishment and deliver it in overwhelming quantities. But in the hands of a pilot who understood its capabilities, the P-47 Thunderbolt was as deadly as any fighter ever built. Neel Kearby understood that better than anyone. He developed the tactics that maximized the Thunderbolt's strengths. He trained the pilots who would use those tactics to devastating effect. He led from the front, flying into combat alongside the men he commanded, demonstrating through personal example that the big fighter could dominate the Pacific sky. And on one October morning in 1943, he proved it beyond any doubt. 4 aircraft against 48, 6 kills in 15 minutes. A Medal of Honor earned through superb daring after his mission was completed. The Japanese pilots who survived that engagement over Wewak learned a painful lesson about the American Thunderbolt that day. The big fighter, that looked too slow and too clumsy to compete with their agile Oscars and Tonys, had descended on them like a thunderbolt in truth, striking from above with devastating force and climbing away before they could respond. 9 of their comrades were dead. Among the casualties were a squadron commander and a wing commander, experienced pilots whose loss the Japanese 4th Air Army could not easily replace. This was how technological and tactical superiority manifested in air combat. Not through single decisive advantages, but through the accumulation of smaller edges. The Thunderbolt was faster in a dive. Its 8 machine guns delivered overwhelming firepower. Its robust construction absorbed damage that would have destroyed Japanese aircraft. Its turbocharged engine performed superbly at the high altitudes where Kearby chose to fight. None of these advantages was individually decisive, but combined, in the hands of a skilled pilot using sound tactics, they produced results like October 11th, 1943. The lesson applied beyond the specific aircraft involved. Every fighter has strengths and weaknesses. The pilot who understands his aircraft's capabilities, who develops tactics that maximize strengths and minimize weaknesses, who maintains discipline even when tempted to chase additional kills, will usually prevail over pilots who fight the wrong kind of fight. Kearby demonstrated this principle brilliantly during his Medal of Honor mission, and he demonstrated the consequences of violating it during his final flight 5 months later. That contradiction defines Neel Kearby's legacy. He was brilliant enough to develop tactics that transformed the perception of an aircraft that many considered unfit for Pacific combat. He was skilled enough to score 22 aerial victories in less than 6 months of combat flying. He was brave enough to attack a formation of 48 enemy aircraft with only 3 wingmen at his side. And he was human enough to make a fatal mistake when the pressure of competition pushed him to violate his own principles. Time magazine called him one of the great fighter pilots of World War II, shortly after his death. The Dallas Morning News hailed him as one of Texas' immortals. The United States Air Force honored him in 1959 with the dedication of Neel Kearby Hall, a training facility at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. The Texas Historical Commission erected a marker citing his achievements. A life-sized statue stands on the grounds of the public library in Arlington, Texas, where Kearby attended high school before the war. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Neel Kearby is simply this. When the P-47 Thunderbolt arrived in the Pacific in 1943, experienced pilots looked at it and laughed. They called it too big, too slow, too clumsy to survive against the agile Japanese fighters that dominated the theater. 6 months later, the 348th Fighter Group had proven them wrong beyond any reasonable argument. Over 150 kills, 8 pilots lost, the most successful Thunderbolt unit in the Pacific War. That transformation happened because one man refused to accept the conventional wisdom about his aircraft. One man studied the Thunderbolt's characteristics, identified its true capabilities, developed tactics that maximized its strengths, and trained an entire fighter group to execute those tactics with deadly precision. One man led from the front, demonstrating through personal example that the Thunderbolt could dominate any sky when flown correctly. His name was Neel Kearby. He was 32 years old when he died. He left behind a wife, 3 sons, and a tactical legacy that shaped fighter doctrine for generations. He earned the Medal of Honor by attacking 48 enemy aircraft with 4 Thunderbolts and emerging victorious. And he proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the aircraft everyone dismisses as inadequate for combat can become the most devastating weapon of all. It just requires the right pilot to show everyone else how to use it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.